Hello and welcome to this year's celebration of International Day of Sport for Development and Peace. My name is Melissa Fleming and I am Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. I am so pleased to present this year's celebration, which highlights the power of sport as a tool to address the climate crisis. As the UN Secretary General said recently, we are sleepwalking to a climate catastrophe. We recognize that as the window of opportunity for action is rapidly closing, it is more important than ever to seek out every opportunity, every avenue for solutions. The climate crisis requires both a global response and innovative action. And as we will explore today, sport has a very unique role to play. To begin today's conversation on the role of sport in combating climate change, it is my honor to introduce the United Nations Deputy Secretary General, AMINA Mohammed.
Excellencies, colleagues, friends and sports fans, I'm pleased to join you for the 2022 International Day of Sport for Development and Peace. From makeshift playing fields to giant arenas, we see how sport unites and inspires people all around the world. Sport promotes respect and equality and is an effective catalyst for communities to embrace diversity, foster inclusion, and advance development and peace for all, including for persons with disabilities, women and girls and youth, among others. Sport also provides a platform for tackling some of the gravest global threats to people and planet, like climate change, which is right now wreaking havoc in all countries with the greatest impacts on the poor and the vulnerable. We need urgent action and transformative action from all quarters, including sports and the billions of people involved as participants, facilitators, owners, advertisers, and supporters. As the Secretary General has said, we must go into emergency mode against the climate crisis because the battle to keep the 1.5 Celsius goal alive will be won or lost in this decade. And we are far off track. Major sporting events and leagues, athletes and fans alike are poised to be powerful advocates for collective and collaborative political action. The business of sport must show real leadership by slashing its carbon footprint this year and this decade, encouraging higher ambition from the private sector and promoting low-cost, high-impact, inclusive and accessible solutions. Most crucially, we need everyone involved in sport to speak up much louder and demand bolder actions from governments and businesses alike. Sports stars, pundits, sponsors, and their creative partners are among the most influential personalities on the planet. I urge you all to call on governments and business to accelerate the renewable energy transition, to phase out coal, and to help build climate resilience in local communities everywhere. Use your voices and your platform to connect with people and youth in the billions and fire up their passions. Show leaders that a just, healthy, and net zero carbon planet is inevitable and that it must quicken. I hope you leave today's conversation on the role of sport in combating climate change inspired to take meaningful action to fight the climate crisis and drive forward all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It is a fight we will win or lose together. More than ever, we must unite as one team, working together to create a safer, inclusive, and more peaceful and more sustainable future for all. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Deputy Secretary General and echo her very important words. No one can tackle the climate crisis alone, but we can do it together. We must speak up to create positive change on a much bigger scale. Our voices are much louder when we raise them together. And now, to help us better understand the connection between sport and climate action, I would like to introduce LINDITA XHAFERI-SALIHU, who leads the UN Sport for Climate Action framework.
Thank you. Today, we remind ourselves that it is crucial to remain fully engaged in strengthening and sustaining peace and development. But as we know, progress that has been made so far is severely being threatened by the impacts of climate change. As stated by the Deputy Secretary General, the impacts of climate change are already adversely affecting vulnerable communities, as well as stretching the capacities of societies and governments. As we look for ways to rally people together on the urgency to act on climate, sport provides us with that unique connective tissue that binds us together, both across and within societies. That's why UN Climate Change, through the Sports for Climate Action Framework, works with sports sector to ensure the industry can play a significant and influential role in addressing climate change. We're working with some of the best well-known organizations in the world of sports who have come together under UNFCCC Sports for Climate Action, committed to a pathway aligned with limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, working to create plans on how to get there, following up those plans with concrete actions, and being transparent throughout the entire process. You may ask, why sport? Climate change is a serious threat to sport as we know it. Acting on climate is not just a moral issue for sports. More severe weather patterns, extreme temperatures, heavy rains, flooding, and wildfires, all fueled by climate change, will mean more cancelled games and more cancelled events. These extremes can not only damage playing surfaces, but influence health of athletes and fans alike in terms of participation rates and attendance numbers. If sport put resources into fighting climate change, they will eventually reap their rewards with less damage to their players, facilities, and fan base. Sport contributes to a large climate footprint. For example, extensive infrastructure required for elite-level sport, both for large international events and for year-round competitions. Emissions resulting from the travel undertaken by spectators to witness their chosen sporting events in person. These are examples of the significant impact that sport directly has on the climate. If sport put their minds to reducing their environmental impact, they could not only lead through action, but also by example, and can unlock the full potential of us all. Sport can drive change across the system because we know the power of sport. In an often divided world, it is hard to think of many as powerful as the stadiums we fill to cheer for our favorite teams and players. Imagine all sports using their platforms to educate their athletes and fans and bring them along in the journey. Imagine all sports positively advocating for climate action towards policymakers, their supply chain, sponsors, and their communities, and building partnerships to drive change across the system. What sports do matters, and it matters because right now we are losing. The latest IPCC report states in no uncertain terms that we are now at the end game for winning or losing the fight against climate change. We see Sports for Climate Action as a mass movement that has already started but has so much more to give. But we need more action, and we need to go much faster. My challenge to all of you today is to help us strengthen and accelerate Sports for Climate Action movement. Help us demonstrate that action is taking place. Help us amplify the message that meaningful climate action is required now by each and every one of us.
Thank you, Lindita. I, for one, am inspired by the challenge to walk the talk with real climate action. Turning words into action is the key to addressing this crisis. It is now my pleasure to introduce NBCLX broadcast journalist Tabitha Lipkin, a correspondent who specializes in sports and environmental programming. Tabitha joins us to moderate two exciting discussions, one with leaders in the business of sport and the other with elite athletes who are making a mark both in competition and on the environment. Over to you, Tabitha.
Thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here. I'm your panel moderator, Tabitha Lipkin, and while at first glance, sport might not be the first thought that comes to mind when thinking about climate change, the two are very much so intertwined, as both a contributor to climate change and a pioneer in fighting it. To bring the conversation on sport and climate change to the forefront, we have amazing panelists from every corner of the sports industry here to share their knowledge and passion for both sport and for saving our incredible planet. Allow me to introduce our first group of panelists. we have MIHIR WARTY, Chief Strategy Officer, World Rugby, and BODOUR AL-MEER, Sustainability Director, Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy 2022 FIFA World Cup. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. As I just said, sport is both a contributor to and casualty of climate change, and involving billions of people globally as either participants, facilitators, or even spectators. In what ways can sports and organizations like yours help curb emissions? And I will actually start with you, MIHIR.
Thank you, Tabitha. Thanks for having World Rugby on this. It's a really important issue to us, and we really appreciate the chance to talk about this challenge for us. World Rugby is absolutely committed to trying to look at the issue of climate change, what we can do about it, both from reducing emissions and our contribution to climate change, but also how we can convince our fans, our audiences, our players, our spectators to play their part as well. We're primarily doing that by our own operations, how we run ourselves as a business. But really, once we have ourselves sorted out and our own credibility in that place established, we want to do what we can to convince our fans through our communications, through our social media engagement, through the fact that we host the third largest sporting event in the world, the Rugby World Cup, to really ensure that all of those who follow the sport around the world can appreciate the difference they can make. We're a sport that's played outdoors. We're dependent on grass pitches, on the environment being healthy for our players and our fans. Climate change obviously has potential repercussions there. Our sport is prevalent and played to a high degree in the Pacific Islands, for example, who are highly exposed to the issues of climate change. So this matters very, very importantly to us. It matters to our players, it matters to our fans, it matters to our commercial partners as well. They're very committed to this as well. So we are trying to do everything we can to address this one issue that certainly an opponent we can't help but tackle.
Right. BODOUR?
Well, by being responsible champions and doing the right things through our mitigation and offset programs, also supporting the right thing to all our stakeholders in the country, and communicating the right thing. I mean, as a World Cup, we have all the eyes on us. So we have to set a benchmark and a role model in this regard.
I really want to dive into that just a little bit more too. You know, BODOUR, MIHIR, if climate change continues at the rate that it is currently at, how will the FIFA World Cup and World Rugby be affected, including, you mentioned a little bit, the players, the fans? BODOUR, I'll start with you.
Well, the SC recognized the climate change from the very beginning of the program. So we've worked to ensure that we had considered the potential impacts in designing our stadiums. Climate modeling was conducted to identify the 2022 temperatures and other climate impacts. These climate files were then incorporated in designs for infrastructure and cooling systems. This way we designed our stadiums to be ready for the future.
And MIHIR?
Well, on a grassroots level, we're already seeing issues.
Right.
We're seeing increased flooding of our pitches in many nations around the world, which is inhibiting the ability for people to take part in the sport. So there's a direct issue already. There's also an issue in terms of some of our countries, which are, for example, 1 in 4 players, professional players around the world, come from the Pacific Islands. Those low-lying islands in the Pacific are highly exposed to the dangers of climate change and flooding and issues there as well. So there are already repercussions we're seeing. In terms of what we're doing about that, obviously trying to address that ourselves, we're looking at things like artificial grass pitches to look at whether or not they can make a difference and be more sustainable. We're also looking at where we might take our particular competitions and our particular events to make sure they're as environmentally sustainable as possible.
I also want to know, how can your organizations bring the climate crisis really to the forefront of fans and consumers and the immediate need of how it's affecting everyone? And this time, I'll actually start with you, MIHIR.
Well, it's interesting. I think this is something that is already an issue for many of our fans. We've really recognised this. This is whenever we canvass fans about issues that matter to them beyond our sport, environmental sustainability actually comes up very high, especially amongst our younger fans and our younger followers. So we have a constituency there we want to engage and support. And we want to show leadership in this area, to show them the things that we're doing about environmental sustainability, but also give them the opportunity to do more and more in this area as well. So when it comes to our major events, our Rugby World Cups, for example, or our 7 series, we want to make sure that we're communicating with fans to show them easy ways to make simple changes that will have an impact on making the environment better than it is otherwise.
And what are some of those easy changes?
Well, for example, a really small thing is to have more reusable water bottles available at matches, to have a wider choice of food, so we have more vegan or vegetarian food to offset, obviously, some of the environmental impacts of, say, meat-based products. Just some, there's a lot of basics we can get in place that will make a difference when they all add up together. Also, looking whenever we're thinking of operating a competition, actually looking at the impact of flying players around the world,
Right.
taking that into account, and look at whether or not we actually do, actually take that into account when assessing where we might host an event. So all of these things add up, and those are just a handful of things that we're working on.
And BODOUR?
Well, as a host country, we've tried to set the stage by being climate aware and responsible. We've worked with all our stakeholders teams, our transportation, energy, accommodation, logistics, and catering partners, for example, to support and encourage and partner in their journey to lower the carbon emissions. But there is still great stuff that can be taken on personal action levels. It is, after all, everyone's job, and we all have to play our part. And of course, the fans and the audience can play a big part in this regards. For example, by using reusable water bottles, by using the metro, by using, environmentally friendly transportation, the scooter, the bicycle.
So we've kind of taken like this high-level overview of how sports and climate change are interconnected, how it's affecting fans, participants, ourselves. But I'm curious, you're both here because you're both passionate about climate change and you work in sports. So I want to know where your passion comes from and when you decided to get involved. BODOUR, I'll start with you.
Well, when I used to work in the oil and gas industry, and then I've changed my career from the oil and gas to the sporting industry. So having oil and gas background, I think it helped me a lot in solving the problem in the sporting industry, starting from, in our case in Qatar, from the stadium. So we've worked so hard to build an environmentally friendly stadiums. Our stadiums reduces the energy consumption by 40%. It reduces the water consumption by 30%. And then setting the target of a carbon neutral tournament. So we were trying to mitigate and reduce and eliminate as much as we can. I think personally, I wanted to set a benchmark in sustainability and in carbon, especially in the World Cup. I believe we will be the first most sustainable FIFA World Cup to date, and the first fully carbon neutral tournament.
Thank you for sharing, MIHIR. I want to hear your story too.
Mine's more personal, I guess. I have a 9-year-old somewhere in the house here who is not passionate about sports administration, but is very, very passionate about the environment. And is proud of her daddy if he can do something about the environment that she's going to grow up into. So she does that at her school, looking at how the school looks at its procurement processes, the way it operates, its lighting, its energy sources. And that's what we can do as a business at World Rugby. Look at how we are procuring, how we are operating, how we choose where to tour, how we choose how to operate our tournaments. So that is a direct parallel, and that's, I guess, the North Star that drives a lot of my motivation.
Well, we are also proud of her daddy, so we appreciate you both sharing kind of more of this personal experience. Finally, our audience who's watching right now, they want actionable items. They want something they can take away from this conversation. So what do you wish to share with our audience about how they can be a part of this fight too? MIHIR, I'll start with you.
So I think the big thing we can all do as individuals, as people within businesses, as consumers, is make our choices and make our choices count. So I think it's all about thinking when you're making those choices, whether it's a sport to follow, a product, a bit of merchandising to spend your money on. Think about the long-term impact of what you're doing as best as you can. And those small interactions that we all make, those small choices, will help make the world a better place, no doubt.
Right. BODOUR?
I agree with Mihir. I mean, it's all about personal choices. After all, this is the environment is our responsibility. We live, we all share the same responsibility. So it's personal choices, and it comes from small and little things, like using, as I said earlier, reusable water bottles instead of plastic bottles. Using the metro or the bicycles or the scooter to move from one area to another, conserve the use of the water, for example. There are so many things that they can do in this regard.
Right, we only get this one planet. And just like it says behind MIHIR, life is not a rehearsal. Thank you to our amazing first group of panelists, MIHIR and BODOUR, for sharing your knowledge and helping our viewers understand a little bit more about the cause and effects of sport and climate change. Now, our next group of panelists are world-renowned athletes whose passion for sport can be seen beyond any competition, and you can also see it on the front lines of climate action. I have the great honor of introducing Jessie Diggins, Olympic gold medalist, Protect Our Winters board member, Boris HERRMANN, ocean skipper for Team Malizia, and TATYANA McFadden, 20-time Paralympic medalist and 24-time World Major Marathon winner. What a group I have here, and it is such an honor to have a conversation with you all. And I want to start here actually with the same question I asked the first group. You know, we're talking about sport and climate change, and it's key in this conversation to recognize that sports organizations and sports are both a casualty and a contributor to climate change. What steps can be taken within your own sport to help curb emissions? And Jessie, I'll start with you, then Boris and TATYANA.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor to be here, especially alongside such incredible athletes. And I think, first of all, I'd just like to talk about the elephant in the room. Right. I think sports is both something where we appreciate and recognize the need to take action on climate change, but we are a contributor. And I think it's important because we are often fed this narrative that only personal action is how this is going to change and how we're going to fix it. But I think it's important to recognize that there is a space there for imperfect advocacy where, no, like, I'm not completely off the grid. I do have to travel in order to compete and to do my job. But at the same time, I'm able to leverage the platform that sports gives me to help inspire people to take their own action and to drive systemic change. So I think recognizing that we're able to use sport to inspire people to find a way to connect to the outdoors and to decide that they want to call their representative and senator and say what they want, to talk about why they want to protect this amazing, beautiful planet. I think there's a really cool space there where sport can inspire people as well. So I just want to recognize that, no, we're not perfect, and that's okay because we're doing all the steps that we can, and we're looking forward to try to, create a solution.
Beautifully put, Boris.
Yeah, I really go with that. I totally agree. I think the power of sport in general is we can inspire through emotion and hopefully inspire action, and that's what we want to do with our sailing boat, sailing around the world. We witness the beauty of the oceans, but also the threat for the ocean, and oceans are heavily impacted by climate change and very important for the whole context of climate change. And so we write on our boat, on our sailing boat, it's a race we must win, climate action now. And so we basically sail around this banner and try to use our sport for this voice of action and trigger also with the enthusiasm of sport, like as an athlete, we are about doing stuff. And yeah, this is one thing that I think any sport can do, but sailing has probably a specific role or possibility because we are in nature. We use the power of nature to go emission-free around the world. We sailed with Greta Thunberg emission-free across the Atlantic to New York, and I hope that sailing can be really have its special position to inspire to use more the power of the wind and the power of nature.
It is a race that we must win. There's no question about that. TATYANA?
Thank you again so much for having me. There's no question that climate change is a major worldwide challenge that impacts all people. But the reality is that it disproportionately impacts the disabled population. and sadly, and sadly, people with disabilities are often left out of the conversation. So, as an elite athlete with 28 Paralympic medals, I'm just so pleased and honored to add my voice and perspective to this really important conversation. For Paralympic athletes, I think this is so important because I don't want to see people with disabilities like myself suffering and dying because we're not part of the conversation. Climate change is real and everyone needs to be part of it. So some of the things that I have been involved with and really honored was the launch of the We the 15 campaign that seeks to put persons with disabilities in the heart of the diversity inclusion agenda. That includes putting people with disabilities in the conversation about climate change. The agenda of the We the 15 includes implementing a range of activities targeting governments, businesses, public drive to social inclusion for people with disabilities, as well as breaking down social and systematic barriers that are preventing persons with people with disabilities from fulfilling their potential and being active members of society. Ensuring great awareness, visibility, representation of purpose of persons with people with disabilities. In addition of the We the 15 campaign, I was really honored to have the conversation with the U.S. Deputy Secretary General about how the 2030 agenda for the Center of Sustainable Development can partner with people with disabilities to achieve sustainable developmental goals. This is really important, and we took that action ahead of the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games, and I'm so excited to see what the future can help change for people with disabilities as climate change is happening.
Yes, and thank you for explaining more about We the 15, an incredible organization. So I want to bring it around to this as well, because all of you see that sport is affected by climate change. You see it in your own divisions as well, whether you're sailing around the world, you have a sea monitor. Boris, I would love to kind of talk a little bit more about how you've seen your sport affected from the time you started and to this point in your career, and your concerns for the future as well. Boris, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Concerns, so regards to that, we need a stable climate and these patterns of wind on the ocean to be able to safely navigate the oceans and do the racing we do on these highly technical boats, and they are also quite fragile racing machines. We have already experienced some strange weather patterns that were quite unusual on some races. I did a race around the world non-stop, and it was supposed to take 80 days. But it took 100 days, and we didn't have enough food. There was the Antarctic in that southern summer was warmer, that more ice broke off, and that made our route longer.
Wow.
And then we didn't have enough food. And my teammate, we were 2 on the boat, lost 15 kilos of weight. And, these are things you really don't forget and make you start think about what is a context between climate change and this the warming and this ice drifting off north, I think with sailing we can have glimpses of moments where we witness climate change on a planetary scale even, and on top of that we have the possibility to collect very precise data about the ocean condition, like the ocean CO2 level, the concentration of CO2, the temperature, etc. And these are things hard to come by for the scientists. They can't measure this precisely with satellites. And so there we are really privileged to also be able to contribute to climate science at the same time. And so we use a bit for storytelling as well. Because we are out there, we can measure these things. And climate change, unfortunately, is something that we see by bare eyes. Also, there are some we can observe. Sometimes there are huge algae fields on the ocean where the boat almost gets stuck, and these are like even visible from satellite pictures. And these get more and more also to ocean warming and change of oxygen levels in the ocean.
And there was a big talk about this around the Winter Olympics as well. Jessie, I think you can speak to this, especially with the ice melt.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates with me, what Boris was saying, because you can sometimes see it with just your eyes. And having traveled around the World Cup circuit, I think it was very shocking to me to see how often now we're racing on just a strip of snow with green grass and mud on the side of the trail. And especially what that does, not just to our sport, because I understand that sport is not the most important thing out there, but to the communities that are hosting these races, to people who live there, who depend on winter tourism for their job, for their livelihood, who depend on stable seasons to survive. And a lot of the times in these communities that we're coming to race in, they are living with a much smaller carbon footprint, but they are being affected by climate change as well. And so it really brings it home that it is everyone's job to speak up and to take all the steps that we can to mitigate climate change, because it really is affecting us all around the world. And I think that's where it was shocking for me, is to see that this isn't just one race venue or 1 year. It's been very steady, it's been constant, and it's been all around the globe.
Sometimes it feels like we're living and don't look up, but you got to look up. It's happening. Tatyana, I now throw it to you. I'm very curious to know how you've seen the change since you started your career until now too. The people around you as well.
Yeah, exactly. I first became aware of the impact of weather and climate on our global movement when I competed at my first Paralympic Games at the age of 15. I realized that with the challenge I had with hydration, by the exacerbation of climate and fluctuations that was experienced by all athletes, but especially athletes with disabilities. I've also learned the lack of proper hydration that can lead to heat stroke or most extreme cases of death. So this is directly related to the problem with hydration is circulation. So the majority with athletes with disabilities are having problems with their circulation related to their disability, which impacts sweating rate and our ability to stay warm, our training and our competitions, and just every single day part of our life. I am so fortunate to be on Team USA, working with dietitians, working on hydration levels, but most people around the world do not have this access. And so we need to talk about this. And, as well as looking at the worldwide population, people with disabilities are increasing concerns about how drastic climate change will impact this population. Power shutoffs that impact people who require power to sustain their life, increasing evacuations that's caused by storms and wildfires. Most people with disabilities cannot get into rubber dinghies. So what is the plan B? And so I've just noticed a little bit around this, traveling the world, competing. I'm also not only a summer athlete, but a winter athlete as well. So around the world, some places are getting very, very hot and some places are getting very, very cold, or the opposite is happening where warm places are getting cooler, cooler places are getting warmer. And so we definitely need to take that action now.
So all three of you are here because you're passionate, not only in your fields, but also for climate change. People watching, they want to be able to take action as well. So how can you each individually kind of use your sport to push the climate crisis to the forefront and to make sure that individuals can take action, know how to take action in order to help fight this climate crisis? And Jessie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is where sport can be a really positive force for change, because we're able to hopefully inspire and reach the next generation and, help people create their own moments of change. And so I guess for me, it's really cool to say, after the last couple Olympics, so many more people, especially from my home state, were more invested in cross-country skiing. They went out, they tried the sport, they found out that they loved winter, and suddenly they have a very personal reason to care, right? Suddenly they are so invested in keeping snow around and making sure that the kids that they've just introduced to this really fun sport have the opportunity to do that sport for the rest of their life. And so I think it's a little bit of a twofold approach where athletes and sport can hopefully inspire people, connect them with a reason to care, make climate change a little bit more of an accessible issue, because it can seem very overwhelming and a little bit hopeless at times. But when you break it down to, all right, we want to, continue to be able to sail safely. We want to be able to race around the world. We want our kids to be able to experience making a snowman. Suddenly you bring it down to these smaller slices of why this is so important. And then the second half of that is, for example, with my work with Protect Our Winners, it's very, very easy. People can join Protect Our Winners on their website. There's forms where you can fill out a letter to your senator or your representative. They have different campaigns where, we're protecting public lands and trying to make sure that we're keeping them as a way of reducing our carbon footprint. And so there's very easy channels of connecting to your representatives and trying to drive that larger systemic change that will ultimately help turn the ship around. So trying to take sport, make people find a way to care, and then give them very easy, accessible tools to be able to add their voice in a positive way. And then they feel very empowered because there are steps that they can take.
Right, it's all about localizing it in order to get to those systematic changes. Tatyana, I'll throw it to you next.
As an athlete, there are other actions that we can take. Remember that while our sponsors support our work, they are also have a huge external audience. It is our job to talk to our sponsors about the importance of their carbon footprint and the significance of zero carbon emissions can have on climate change. Really praising the work of sponsors like Nike, who are moving into the area of sustainable clothing through their line that is made entirely from recyclable material, like the Tokyo 2020 Games. Also telling stories that will bring the challenge of climate change to life for others. For example, the story of 4 alumni of the U.S. Department of State Global Sports mentoring program in South Africa that advocated on the behalf of people with disabilities in rural communities during the height of COVID-19. They delivered food and healthcare equipment to para-athletes who were suffering from food insecurity while providing local adaptive sports teams with sporting equipment, ensuring that they stay healthy and active during the lockdown. And food insecurities is really huge during the climate crisis. And we are seeing this in Paralympic athletes globally. And I can't imagine seeing it, outside of that as well. It's very, very difficult. And finally, we must use the power of our collective voices for a broader impact. So I just think that the continued talk about disability and sport and climate change, we will have a greater impact.
And thank you for continuing to bring that to the forefront and to fight for those with disabilities. Boris, I'm curious what your takeaway action would be as well.
Yeah, for me, I think, of course, we can all individually do small steps that collectively to the bigger movement. We can, first of all of us, try to avoid wasting energy, try to turn to greener ways of consumptions and use our voice as consumers, use green energy at the house or something like this. But what we try to focus on as a team is the bigger solutions. Lots of the things we were speaking about that earlier. As athletes, we need to fly to the events, so we need solutions for these things. We need like sustainable aviation fuel, and technical innovation and solutions are around, and this is something we would like to heavily promote. And I think it's a movement now. Huh? We all speak about change, and so this is a movement we can all kind of get behind, hopefully, and we can spread the word of being curious and promoting action and having this positive mindset of doing things, and things have to happen quicker. And there's no is not an answer. So this is a race we must win. We need to charge forward at a much faster rate, and we need to be inspiring ourselves about the belief that there are solutions out there, that there are possibilities, and if we put our joint efforts together that we can turn this around.
And you all have. You've inspired our viewers. You've inspired me. I have to say thank you so much, Tatyana, Jessie, Boris, for coming here, for having this conversation, these thoughtful responses, making sure that there is action on climate change, and it's a systematic change, right? And as you've just learned from our conversation here today, sport is a contributor and a casualty of climate change. This is an emergency. The planet has already warmed by as much as 1.2 degrees, and we're already seeing the devastating consequences pretty much everywhere. Our mission is to soften the blow. The time for change is right now. We can do this together through sport and beyond. I'm Tabitha Lipkin. Thank you so much again to all of our panelists today, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, Tabitha, and the inspiring professionals and athletes you spoke with for highlighting so many compelling climate solutions. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Vien Trong, the Senior Director of Global Engagement for Sustainability at Nike, who is here to speak to us about the business of sport.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. If there's no planet, there's no sport. It's that simple. Climate action is the right thing to do. It's also the necessary thing to do as a business. We in the sports industry and the private sector writ large have an obligation and an outsized opportunity to create change. From our own supply chains to setting science-based targets, to rallying fans, consumers, and our employees, we can help advance climate action in loud and quiet ways. After working on climate solutions in communities, in policy, in philanthropy, I came to Nike because I saw how the sports industry can play an active role in combating the climate crisis. You know, for me, my job is not about work. It is about a commitment that I have made to my family, to my community, and to communities like the one I grew up in, communities that are struggling at the front lines. We know that climate change affects us all, but it especially hurts families in low-income communities and communities of color. You see, my family have always lived in those communities that were struggling for a more secure future. I'm a refugee from Vietnam. My family came to the U.S. as part of the boat people migration, fleeing a war. They came to the U.S. to work as laborers. In my entire life, we have lived near busy roads and highways, toxic sites and contaminated soils, conditions that have resulted in our communities dying 10 years earlier than those that lived in a more affluent area just a few miles away. As a kid, I often asked, why are things this way? As I have matured, I've joined others in asking a different question. How can we drive solutions? And that's why I'm so proud to work at a company with teammates who share my commitment, who get up every day to tackle climate change, and, like today's theme urges us, to advance a sustainable future for all. Businesses play a key role in advancing that just and sustainable future. And we at Nike, we have a vision for zero carbon and zero waste. Sustainability sits at the foundation of how we approach our brand and our business. This approach drives innovation across every part of our organization, from what we make to how we make it, from how we get it to athletes and how we take it back and transform it to something new. We've set bold, science-based targets aligned to the Paris Climate Agreement. And we're partnering across the industry to drive collective action. We at Nike exist to serve athletes. There's an important asterisk, though, when we say athletes, because it's noting our belief that if you have a body, you are an athlete. And today, athletes are talking about how climate change is impacting them and the sport they love. Heat's canceling sporting events. Extreme weather events are making pitches unplayable. So you see, climate change isn't just impacting the athletes, it's threatening the very future of sports itself. So we're tackling climate change with an athlete's mindset. Determination, persistence, and relentless focus is how we work, how we do our work. And we're also knowing that this work is important to do as a team. We all have a role to play, and success is dependent on us collectively working together. From signing on to the UNFCCC Fashion Charter to partnering across sectors to transform to net zero, we are collaborating across the industry to reduce our collective footprint. And with the UN, we are racing to net zero. As the urgency of climate change continues, let us not wait for solutions. Let's create them together. As we say around here, this is not game over. This is game on.
To close our program, it is my honor to welcome Her Excellency Isabel Pico, Permanent Representative of the Principality of Monaco to the United Nations, and Her Excellency Alia Ahmed bin Saif Al-THANI, Permanent Representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations. And thank you to my colleague Robert Skinner, Chief of Partnerships and Global Engagement in the Department of Global Communications, who will engage the ambassadors in a discussion on the important intersection of sport, government, and climate action.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome, Your Excellencies. Thank you for joining us for the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace. It's such a pleasure to see you both today. We've heard a number of people speaking today about the importance of sport in combating climate change, from athletes to industry leaders in sport, and how sport can be a part of the solution to our climate crisis. But I'm very interested in hearing now from both of you how you think sport and government can work together for climate action. And ambassadors, you co-chair the group of UN member states called the Group of Friends of Sport for Sustainable Development, which looks to encourage governments to integrate sport actively into their policies and strategies. And it'd be great to hear a little bit from each of you about how you go about working with that group of friends and how you see government's role in tackling the climate crisis. I'm going to go to you first, Ambassador Pico. You've been the co-chair of the group of friends since 2010, I just learned, and I'd like to hear from you a little bit about how you view governments working on this issue of sport and climate action.
So I'm going to be very straightforward. You know, we adopted the program 2030 and the SDGs 17, and at least 10 of them can help implement the SDGs. Sport can help implement at least 10 of them. So we think obviously about health with non-communicable diseases. We think about education because it's important to have a rule-based activities in school with children. We think about gender equality with co-ed sport. But we don't think obviously enough about, as you said, climate change, oceans, resilience of society, the importance of cities, planning. So all those things that are not obvious, sport can have a very positive influence.
Great, thank you. And Ambassador Al-THANI, it's certainly a big year for Qatar.
Absolutely.
In the world of sport, but how do you think of your role within the group of friends?
Absolutely.
What government can do?
Thank you so much, Robert, and again, thank you for organizing such an excellent event on International Sports Day. Of course, we have the pleasure of co-chairing the group of friends together with Monaco. We took over from Tunisia since 2018, and sports is very close to our hearts in Qatar. Of course, for us, we have long recognized the contribution of sports to development, to peace, to health. Qatar is actually the first country in the region to dedicate a national holiday for sports, and we're one of the few around the world. So this says a lot about how we recognized the centrality of sports in our daily life, and of course to the contribution to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know that we will be hosting the FIFA World Cup in Doha in November. The launch date will be the 21st of November, and of course for us the FIFA World Cup is in itself an opportunity to set up new benchmarks for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we will make sure that the tournament will highlight that in every aspect of its activities.
Great, and I can say that I've actually had the pleasure of being in Qatar for the National Day of Sport several years ago.
Yes.
So I know how seriously Qatar takes that day and how many people get engaged with it. But you mentioned the FIFA World Cup, and of course, congratulations to Qatar for hosting.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you see the government working with FIFA and others around climate change, and how
Absolutely.
This important sporting event, critical event, will come about with the government and FIFA?
Absolutely. So the urgency for climate action is felt everywhere, and I'm sure sports is another tool to address climate change. And I mean, Qatar has already committed to deliver the first carbon neutral FIFA World Cup. The government has been investing heavily the last few years in terms of maintaining that aspect. The sustainability, the need to address climate action, even during the tournament. We've invested a lot in delivering energy efficient stadiums, as well establishing low emission transportation system, plastic neutrality, dealing with waste management as well. All of that really says a lot in how important to us to position the FIFA World Cup, the next FIFA World Cup in Doha, to really address climate action in every aspect of the work. Let me give you an example. One of the stadiums that was built, known as the Ras Abu Aboud Stadium, was actually built from recycled shipping containers. And to be specific, 974 shipping containers. And the number actually reflects the country code of Qatar. This is one example. Another example where we have really showcased the idea of donating certain aspects of the stadiums. For example, the seats in many of the stadiums, over I think 100,000 seats, will be removed and donated to developing countries for them to contribute to their sports infrastructure. So for us, that moment, the FIFA World Cup in 2022 in Doha, will be a moment to transform the power of football for the benefit of humanity. That's the slogan, and that's what we will take beyond the FIFA World Cup. That will be the legacy.
No, great. It's amazing to hear about the legacy, and we're all looking forward to the World Cup later this year. Ambassador Pico, Monaco certainly plays host to a large number of sporting events as well. Is a significant player in hosting tennis, Formula One, all kinds of different events. And so clearly Monaco has a close relationship with sport as it thinks about battling climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think about that?
Well, this is extremely important because, you know, for sport and athletes to thrive, you need a healthy planet. And Prince Albert II is president of the Commission of the IOC on Sustainability and Legacy. And the International Olympic Committee has been working for many years, and I would say even decades, starting in Lillehammer in 1994, to ensure that infrastructures, mobility, management, workforce, everything is sustainable. And I think it's very important that it becomes a rules-based scenario for all the different world of sport, you know, because you have a professional sport, you have just regular people practicing sport, but they need infrastructures, and this is in cities. So, or elsewhere, some Olympic Games, when you think about it, in Australia, they could, you know, rehabilitate an area that was lost and become again practicable. So there are many examples, and the most important is that it becomes rules-based, that there is accountability, and that it protects not only the environment, but the people making a living with sport. In Monaco, we have forbidden all the single plastic use, for example. I know that Boris HERRMANN probably mentioned about his involvement with the Max Planck Institute and ocean acidification. So there are so many ways where sport and government can work together to mitigate climate change. I think it's an essential part of our societies.
Great. Well, thank you, Excellencies, for being with us today, and thank you for all the contributions you're making to work with the governments here, the member states here at the United Nations, to demonstrate just how much sport can contribute to the work we're doing around the Sustainable Development Goals and specifically around climate change. It's great work and it's important work, and we thank you for that. And so, again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Your Excellencies, for sharing your reflections with us. And once again, I would like to thank all those who participated in today's program for their commitment and for their insights. And as we close this event, a special thank you, the audience, for spending time with us and for your interest in this important topic. Today, we have seen how sport can inspire climate action, expand global awareness, and provide concrete solutions to this crisis. I hope all that you heard today inspires you to learn more and take up the challenge to speak up and demand action on climate change. If you are interested in how you can join the United Nations in taking action, You can start by joining the United Nations Act Now, an individual action campaign on climate change and sustainability. Visit un.org/actnow to learn more. And I thank you again, and happy International Day of Sport for Development and Peace.